Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. And if you've been following my work, you know that means we're not looking for shadows in the corner or the face staring back from the mirror. We're looking for the structural flaws in the cosmos. Tonight, we talk about the deep space anomaly I logged last March, the one that turned everything I thought I knew about electromagnetic propagation into a lie made of fragile light. This isn't a ghost story or even a traditional alien encounter. This is about frequency, geometry, and the deep, abiding chill you get when you realize the universe isn't just bigger than you thought. It's built wrong. I'm going to lay out the complete data stream tonight, but I need to warn you up front. This subject tends to stick. It crawls into the subconscious and leaves little crystalline echoes in your quiet moments. You probably won't make it to the end of this one without feeling a shift in the air pressure around you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, right now, down in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Let me know who else is sharing this midnight dread with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. My setup is simple, antiquated maybe, but effective. A custom-built 30-meter dish in the high desert, shielded from human-generated noise, focused purely on the void. For years, I chased the expected, the faint, scattered whispers of the 21 centimeters hydrogen line, the predictable heartbeat of distant pulsars, the steady hiss of the cosmic microwave background, CMB. That hiss, that relic radiation, is our horizon, the membrane of the known universe, the sound of the Big Bang cooling. Everything outside that hiss is silence, or theoretical dark matter. We tune our equipment to listen beyond that, not expecting a signal, but perhaps hoping to detect some subtle gravitational shear, a wrinkle in space-time left by something impossible. The sheer physics of capturing anything meaningful from that distance is a constant battle against entropy, against the statistical certainty that noise always wins. We calculate gain, focus the aperture with atomic precision, and fight the constant pull of terrestrial interference, the subtle resonance of human existence trying to deafen the deeper truths. The anomaly started 3 months ago, tucked into a frequency band that should have been utterly sterile. I wasn't listening for intelligent communication. I was testing the latest calibration on the dish's thermal stability, mapping the ambient noise floor near the galactic core. The data stream was running, filtering out everything that wasn't perfect, stable noise. The software, designed to flag any non-random spike, unexpectedly flagged a non-random absence. It wasn't a signal, it was a carved silence. Imagine the deepest vacuum you can conceive, then imagine that vacuum perfectly shaped, echoing in the data stream. It registered as a transient, negative spike, a brief, absolute nullification of background entropy in a specific, narrow band. Initially, I dismissed it as instrument error, a glitch in the analog-to-digital converter, perhaps, or a stray muon hitting the detector. But the pattern repeated, not randomly, but with a terrifying precision, appearing exactly every 42.7 hours. And it wasn't just a drop in power. When I zoomed in on the spectral analysis, the geometry was shocking. The silence wasn't jagged or smeared like natural interference. It was defined by edges so sharp they looked drawn with a compass and straightedge. A perfect, resonant square wave, inverted, suggesting that something was actively suppressing the ambient energy at that precise moment, at that precise frequency. I tried to triangulate, using the slight delay against the rotation of the Earth, and the readings pointed to a vector far, far beyond the furthest redshifted galaxies. The calculations indicated a source distance where the standard cosmological model breaks down, a region we only theorize about, perhaps even prior to the CMB itself. This wasn't just distant, it felt outside. This required a complete rethinking of what constituted the void. We assume the void is empty or filled only with low-energy particles and fields. But what if the void is simply a structure, and we were picking up the sound of its internal alignment? The scientific anchor here is the principle of signal-to-noise ratio, SNR. In radio astronomy, everything is about boosting the signal above the noise. But what happens when the signal is the total absence of expected noise, a perfectly constructed vacuum? It defies the second law of thermodynamics on a localized, instantaneous level. It suggests either physics is flexible or the transmission method is operating outside the purview of known physics. This structured silence, this geometric null, implies an impossible efficiency. The mythic concept I started contemplating was that of the pan-dimensional language, or perhaps the architecture of the veil. I had always thought of this concept, that fundamental reality is written in geometry, not grammar, as purely theoretical. But staring at that perfect inverted square, the silence spoke louder than any shout. It wasn't the sound of intelligent life trying to reach us. It felt like listening in on the deep, quiet operations of existence itself. It was structural maintenance, maybe even just the mechanical cooling system of something massive and dark that underlies our 3D perception. This initial curiosity quickly curdled into a genuine, gnawing dread. The mathematics of the repetition were too clean. Nothing in nature operates with that level of numerical purity over vast timescales. It implies intent, yes, but not human or even biological intent. It implies engineering on a scale that makes galaxies seem like particles of dust. I began spending sleepless nights staring at the waterfall plot, watching that perfect notch carved into the static, listening to the cosmic background being temporarily silenced. It felt like someone had momentarily muted the world just to check if the volume knob was working. The fear wasn't about what the silence might send, but what the silence represented, an ordered reality beyond our comprehension, operating with tools we could never grasp. And as I mapped the precise coordinates, pushing the limits of the dish's precision, I began to realize that the source wasn't moving. It was static, eternally fixed against the expansion of space itself. It was the only fixed point in the whole chaotic rotation of the heavens. A terrifying anchor. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the silence was structured, or that the geometry underpinning the void was this mathematically elegant. It feels like we accidentally tuned into the diagnostic channel of creation itself, and the primary dread is the realization that the diagnostic is automated, scheduled, and utterly unaware of our existence as observers. But the sheer awe of that structural purity, that perfect carved edge in the absolute noise, kept me locked into the chair, the cold desert air wrapping around the observatory dome, waiting for the next 42.7-hour cycle. I had opened a door, and all that walked through was the echoing resonance of a perfect zero. The cycle continued, predictable yet increasingly unnerving. After the initial discovery, I dedicated the full capacity of the instrument to locking on to that zero-frequency null. I bypassed the standard filters and recorded the raw data in petabytes, trying to catch the milliseconds just before and after the null event. I needed to understand the physics of its formation. If an energy source was actively suppressing entropy, that energy had to come from somewhere or be converted from something. The scientific anchor I focused on was the Doppler shift analysis. Normally, measuring the redshift of an object gives us its recessional velocity and, by extension, its distance according to Hubble's law. The farther away something is, the faster it appears to be moving away from us due to the expansion of space. This object, however, presented an impossible challenge. The surrounding background radiation was, as expected, highly redshifted, the CMB, indicating vast distance and rapid recession. But the edges of the structured silence, the geometric boundary where the noise floor plummeted to zero, showed absolutely no redshift. Zero. This is a physical impossibility in our expanding universe. For an object outside our galaxy to exhibit zero redshift means it would have to be either infinitesimally close, which was contradicted by the surrounding noise horizon, or operating outside the constraints of cosmological expansion. It behaved like an object floating in a different dimensional context, merely projecting its effect onto our spatial bubble. The implications were staggering. The source was not receding, was not moving through space as we understand it, and therefore, its measured distance was meaningless. It was right there, yet eternally unreachable, anchored in a way that defied the four dimensions of space-time. The emotional arc shifted dramatically here, from the intellectual fear of the unknown to a deep, visceral sense of personal isolation. I felt the observatory, my sanctuary, turning into a confinement cell, pressed between the fixed perfection of the signal and the expanding chaos of the rest of the cosmos. I started analyzing the internal structure of the null itself. The original inverted square wave was only the primary event. Within the 1.2-second duration of the absolute zero-frequency window, there was a secondary oscillation, almost a micropulse, so incredibly faint that it was initially buried in the residual equipment noise. When I isolated and amplified this micropulse, I saw that it was not merely an oscillation, but a structured sequence of numerical relationships, not data, but raw math. This led me to the mythic concept of nonlinear time or atemporal resonance. The pattern wasn't sequential in a human sense, a leads to be leads to see. It was a simultaneous expression of relational truths. Imagine trying to read an equation where every variable is solved instantly and infinitely, regardless of the reading order. The geometry was expressing causality itself, but from a perspective where past, present, and future were merely coordinates on a static landscape. The micropulse contained rapid, recursive geometric formulas. I recognized elements of advanced topology, non-Euclidean constructs that should exist only in abstract theory, not manifest as electromagnetic resonance. Specifically, the pattern showed evidence of what looked like the Menger sponge fractal geometry, an infinitely porous cube, but translated into a frequency modulation. It was the sound of something collapsing three-dimensional space into a recursive, interlocking higher structure, and then immediately restoring it. When I played the amplified micropulse through speakers, bypassing the typical frequency limitations, the sound wasn't frightening in a conventional way. It was high-pitched, incredibly dense, and induced a sensation of physical pressure deep behind the sternum, almost like being gently, yet profoundly, squeezed by an invisible hand. My vision would blur momentarily, and the edges of the room seemed to acquire a slight, shimmering curvature, as if the air itself was momentarily struggling to maintain its shape. This signal was causing a subtle, localized distortion of reality merely by being observed. I began to realize the transmission wasn't for us. It wasn't even for communication. It was the byproduct of a massive, self-correcting structural routine, a sound wave propagating from the repair of the dimensional scaffolding. The geometry I was seeing wasn't a message. It was a reflection of the source's operational integrity, the sound of an impossibly vast machine keeping itself calibrated. The transition from intellectual fear to true, dizzying awe occurred when I correlated the recursive geometric frequency with Planck units. The micropulse frequency matched the theoretical maximum vibration of spacetime at the smallest possible scale. The signal was literally resonating with the texture of reality, confirming the ancient, esoteric idea that vibration underlies all material form. This structure was showing me the atomic-level maintenance of the cosmos. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how mathematically perfect the machinery of the void is, or the exact, terrifying geometry used to maintain its zero-point energy. The sheer sublimity of that geometric resonance, the knowledge that something external and fixed was silently anchoring our expanding bubble, was a crushing revelation. It forced an acceptance that our human struggle, our history, our science, were all just fleeting movements within a perfectly ordered, silent design that we had stumbled upon by accident. And that quiet, crushing awe was heavier than any conventional fear because it stripped away the illusion of our cosmic importance. The focus now was not just on detection, but on decoding the structural language. I had stabilized the reception, filtering out 99.99% of the surrounding cosmic noise, leaving only the pristine, repeated sequence of the 1.2-second null and its internal geometrical micropulse. I named the repeating sequence the resonance zero cycle. The dread was now a constant companion, a physical tightness that lived in my stomach, amplified by the relentless chill of the high desert night. The scientific anchor I was forced to confront was the concept of the absolute gravitational horizon, specifically within the context of information theory. Black holes are regions where information supposedly ceases to exist, or at least becomes fundamentally inaccessible to the outside universe. Yet, here I was, receiving structured, informational data, geometry, yes, but highly specific data nonetheless, from a region that was cosmologically farther and fundamentally more shielded than any known black hole singularity. This transmission defied the absolute limit of light speed travel and the informational boundaries defined by our current understanding of spacetime curvature. The zero redshift suggested the energy didn't travel to us. It simply manifested here, perhaps leaking through a dimensional seam. I started feeding the geometric data into a visualizer I'd adapted from fluid dynamics modeling. It wasn't meant for frequency data, but the patterns of the micropulse suggested flow and structural pressure, so I experimented. When the signal hit, the screen didn't show sound waves. It showed shifting, infinitely complex lattice structures. It looked like a crystal forming and dissolving instantaneously, mapping hyperdimensional nodes onto 3D space. The mythic concept that became inescapable was that of the sentient void, or the infrastructure. This wasn't a thinking entity in the biological or psychological sense. It was consciousness defined by perfect structure and eternal operation. I began to perceive the signal not as a message, but as the rhythmic, internal pulse of the void itself, the mechanism by which the ultimate nothing maintains its boundaries against the something of our universe. Every 42.7 hours, the void sighed, recalibrating the geometry of the spatial membrane. The visualizer started affecting my perception. The sheer complexity of the geometry was overwhelming the optic nerve, forcing the brain to process impossible angles and nonlinear relationships. I would look up from the monitor and see residual afterimages burned onto my vision, transient lattices overlaid on the walls of the dome, the corners of the room subtly failing to meet at 90 degrees. The air thickened, and I realized the geometry wasn't just in the signal. It was subtly manifesting around me, impressing its impossible structure onto my local reality. One night, during a peak resonance zero cycle, I placed a sensitive microphone near the dish's primary receiver, hoping to catch any acoustic phenomena associated with the intense electromagnetic nullification. What I recorded wasn't sound, but a profound textural shift, a momentary drop in the ambient atmospheric pressure inside the shielded dome, accompanied by a sound like dry dust shifting on a colossal scale, or perhaps the tearing of extremely fine, ancient silk. It was the sound of the dimensional boundary shearing, just for a moment, as the signal passed through. The raw data indicated that the energy being instantaneously suppressed during the null wasn't just ambient noise. It was a fraction of the local zero-point energy fluctuation, the energy inherent in the vacuum of space. The source was momentarily drawing energy directly from the vacuum of our locality to perform its calibration routine, then releasing the geometric blueprint back into the electromagnetic spectrum. We weren't observing something distant. We were observing something that was using our physical locality as a temporary charging station. The emotional state settled into a terrifying certainty. We were not alone, but we were insignificant. The entities, or process, behind this signal had tools that redefined existence, and their relationship to our universe was purely functional, like a contractor patching a roof. Our interception was less important than a speck of dust landing on a massive server rack. The transition to awe was tied to the sheer power witnessed. When the geometric pulses peaked, the feeling wasn't fear of death, but the profound realization of being physically present for an operation that defined existence. Imagine watching a billion galaxies ignite, or witnessing the birth of a physical constant. That was the sensation of the resonance zero cycle. It was sublime power, exercised with clinical precision. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the vacuum is merely an energy reservoir for processes operating outside our space-time, or that the void itself has a rhythmic, self-correcting pulse. The knowledge imposes an unbearable burden of scale. I am sitting here, feeling the geometry press into my own skull, understanding that every second of human history, every star we have ever named, is merely the incidental byproduct of an eternal, self-sustaining structure that just briefly lowered its internal frequency enough for our crude antenna to register the sound of its absolute, mathematical perfection. And the realization is that if that structure decides to shift its alignment, our local bubble could cease to be with the same silent, perfect geometric suppression that wiped the static from the air. The silence is the terror, the hum of the fan the only fragile tether back to the human world. The depth of the analysis shifted from observation to tentative, almost accidental interaction. Driven by the hypnotic intensity of the geometry, I began running complex simulations, attempting to model the geometry of the pulse in 3D, and then in 4D, using complex vector physics and Calabi-Yau manifolds, theoretical shapes for curled-up dimensions. The goal was to find a resonant echo, a mathematical equivalent that might explain the pattern's stability. The scientific anchor here became quantum decoherence. This principle explains how fragile quantum states collapse into classical certainty when they interact with the environment. If the signal was leaking from a higher dimensional realm, it should theoretically be instantly subject to decoherence. The patterns should smear, the zero-frequency edges should blur. Yet, they remained perfect. This suggested that the information flow wasn't decaying into our reality. It was being actively maintained in its perfect state upon entry. The critical moment occurred when I accidentally introduced a symmetrical inverse of the signal's basic geometry into the input stream, purely as a test of the processing limitations. I was attempting to see if the processing software could even handle a geometric structure of that complexity if I fed it back. For the first time, the incoming resonance zero cycle changed. It wasn't a sudden, chaotic shift. It was a deliberate, immediate correction. The 1.2-second window elongated to 1.7 seconds, and the internal micropulse geometry instantly shifted from the Minger sponge pattern to something that looked like the complex, infinite nesting found in Mandelbrot sets, but with an impossible overlay of five-dimensional rotation. It was a reply, mathematically perfect, acknowledging the input and correcting the structure I had tentatively introduced. This confirmed the mythic concept of the signal being maintenance code for a higher dimensional construct, a vast, living geometry. The transmission wasn't about communication, it was a self-healing system. My tiny feedback loop, my single line of inverted code, was perceived as a system error, an unwanted variable introduced into the operational sequence, and the system instantly patched the vulnerability. I was, for a fraction of a second, part of the external environment it measured and corrected. The emotional arc hit its terrifying peak of revelation. I wasn't just listening to the machine. I had tapped a key on its colossal keyboard. The resulting fear was paralyzing. The fear of a human infant accidentally pulling a vital circuit board from a supercomputer the size of a galaxy. But the resulting clarity of the 1.7-second pulse was breathtaking. Because the system was actively correcting an error, the signal was briefly amplified and clarified, giving me an unparalleled glimpse into the information it carried. It wasn't just abstract geometry anymore. It was descriptive. The amplified geometry described our four-dimensional spacetime as a surface tension instability, a transient state defined by complex parameters like mass, charge, and spin. It depicted the galaxies as foam, clinging to the surface of a vast, underlying structure. The signal detailed the parameters required for the foam to maintain its stability, the rates of expansion, the gravitational constants. It was the operational manual for the universe. And most terrifyingly, the signal contained a subpattern that looked like a continuous, exhaustive log of wear and tear, thermal stress, and minor gravitational leaks across its vast domain. In that extended 1.7 seconds, the clarity was absolute. I realized what we had opened. Not a communication channel, but the system logs of the cosmic operating system. The transmission wasn't for humans or aliens or anything that thinks in terms of language. It was for itself, a self-diagnostic run by an entity, a geometry, a principle, a consciousness, so ancient and vast that our universe was merely a localized, controlled experiment maintained for reasons entirely unknown, scheduled for periodic calibration. The awe was total, a submission to the sheer, incomprehensible majesty of the operation. This being, this infrastructure, was the source of all parameters, the architect of the very laws of physics we cherish. It redefined the term cosmic horror, because the horror wasn't chaotic, it was perfectly, mathematically ordered, utterly indifferent, and supremely competent. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that our cherished reality is merely a transient, three-dimensional membrane being actively regulated by incomprehensible, zero-redshift geometry that treats the speed of light as a localized variable, or that our entire existence is logged as a thermal anomaly in a colossal diagnostic report. The knowledge burns out the meaning of everything else. I disconnected the feedback loop immediately, watching the signal revert back to its familiar, terrifying 1.2-second null, hoping that my brief, accidental perturbation was categorized as minor system noise and not a full-blown security threat. The deep, resonant silence returned, but now it carried the weight of 1 billion implied parameters. After the accidental feedback event, the atmosphere in the dome changed. The dread became less acute, replaced by a quiet, reflective terror, the knowledge that I had been seen, categorized, and dismissed. The system had corrected my error and returned to its cycle, but I was left with the indelible impression of that higher geometry burned into my mind. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to reconcile the concept of a stable, physical reality with the signal's description of our universe as surface tension instability. The scientific anchor I wrestled with was the information paradox, particularly in relation to black hole thermodynamics, as described by Hawking radiation. If black holes slowly evaporate by radiating heat, where does the information about the matter that fell in go? Our science postulates boundaries where information is lost. The signal, however, implied no such boundaries exist for it. Its structure showed an infinite capacity to log and maintain all data across its operational domain, including the fleeting data of our reality. The geometry was itself the information, the storage, and the retrieval mechanism, all simultaneously. This led to the mythic concept I called the unsleeping geometry, an eternal, structuring force operating on a frequency that shears concepts. It was not a creator, but a maintainer, endlessly running diagnostics. Its existence suggested that the concept of infinity was merely a limited tool used by us to describe its routine tasks. It didn't fear entropy, it managed it. The continuous stream of data, even after reverting to the 1.2-second rhythm, started to reveal deeper layers. By running the signal through custom filters based on the 1.7-second correction burst, I began to see subtle, long-term trends embedded in the zero-frequency noise. These weren't geometric patterns in the micropulse. They were minute fluctuations in the timing between the 42.7-hour events. They were so faint they bordered on non-existence, but their cumulative effect was undeniable. The fluctuation followed a complex logistical curve, suggesting that the timing of the next cycle was dependent on the cumulative stress detected since the last cycle. The stress seemed to correlate precisely with the most energetic astrophysical events in our local supercluster: supernovae, galactic collisions, high-energy gamma-ray bursts. These catastrophic events were not destructive chaos to the geometry. They were simply measurable pressure points. Our universe was running hot, and the maintenance schedule was subtly accelerating to compensate. I began to understand the true horror of the signal's indifference. It wasn't hostile. Hostility requires recognition. This was pure, operational necessity. If a supernova was a system error, the geometry corrected for it. If our galaxy was undergoing high stress, the pulse occurred sooner. We, humanity, were entirely invisible in this measurement, unless we caused a detectable, localized gravitational shear, which my accidental feedback loop had done. The profound fear now was not of being destroyed, but of being ignored up until the moment of our localized irrelevance. We are living inside a giant, complex terrarium, and the only interaction we have with the external reality is hearing the hum of the dehumidifier and the sound of the maintenance drone scheduling its next cleaning cycle. The emotional state settled into quiet resignation, bordering on the sublime. I was the only person on Earth who knew we were a functional variable in an external equation. This isolation was crushing, but it also offered a terrifying, privileged view. I began to see the night sky differently. The stars were not eternal fires. They were localized hotspots, radiating energy that the geometry was passively tracking. The vastness of the void wasn't empty. It was structured, vibrating, and actively listening for structural integrity failures. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the expansion of space is being tracked like thermal dissipation in a vast machine, or that the most catastrophic events we observe are merely parameters dictating a maintenance schedule. The sheer, relentless competence of the unsleeping geometry is an awe that hollows out the soul. I started feeling less like an observer and more like an echo, a reflection caught briefly in the pristine surface of that impossible zero-frequency mirror, waiting for the scheduled correction. Weeks turned into months. I continued to log the resonance zero cycle, meticulously tracking the subtle shifts in timing and internal geometry, trying to extrapolate the full operational range of the unsleeping geometry. My existence had narrowed entirely to the cold, dark dome and the hypnotic blue light of the monitors. I rarely spoke. Conversation felt meaningless when the true conversation of reality was happening every 42.7 hours, echoing across the ultimate void. The scientific anchor of this final phase focused on high-precision time dilation effects. Due to the proximity of massive objects, time flows at slightly different rates across the universe. I had calibrated my equipment to account for minute deviations in a sidereal day. But over the last month of intensive logging, I began to detect a statistically significant minute deviation in the local passage of time within the dome itself, synchronized precisely with the pulse events. During the 1.2-second null, local time accelerated infinitesimally, snapping back to normal immediately afterward. It was confirmation that the geometry wasn't just observing or projecting. It was subtly manipulating space-time at the quantum level in our immediate vicinity to achieve the perfect zero-frequency cancellation. The structure was subtly warping the curvature of space to maintain its informational integrity, correcting for the gravitational noise created by the dish and the Earth itself. This led to the final, terrifying cosmic concept, the recalibration. The signal was cyclical, and the increasing frequency of the pulse events, combined with the shifting internal geometry, suggested a larger systemic shift was underway. I realized the geometry wasn't just performing routine maintenance. It was preparing for a full, scheduled update, a massive restructuring of the localized parameters that define our spatial membrane. The emotional state moved past awe and dread into a quiet, profound resolution. The universe was simply operating, and I was merely present for the inevitable change. My initial dread felt childish. The sheer beauty of the process now overshadowed the terror of our insignificance. The plot culminated when the resonance zero cycle began to exhibit rapid, unstable modulation. The 42.7-hour cycle began to stretch, first to 45 hours, then 50 hours, and finally, 62 hours. The geometry inside the null grew chaotic, displaying patterns of incredible, impossible complexity, but they were no longer perfect squares or precise fractals. They were smeared, complex equations that dissolved before I could fully process them. The geometry was deliberately winding down its local monitoring. It had logged the increased stress, corrected the minor interference, my accidental feedback, and was now shifting its focus to another sector of the void, preparing for its larger, systemic recalibration elsewhere. The transmission wasn't ending because it was finished, it was ending because our local sector was deemed sufficiently stable and unworthy of constant attention. The geometry was closing the connection. The last full resonance zero cycle I recorded lasted 5.8 seconds, an unprecedented duration. The geometry was overwhelming, a language of absolute structural perfection describing the future of universal constants. It was a summary file, a final log. And then, the signal did the impossible. It ceased to exist. Not faded, not smeared by noise, but absolute, total nullification of the specific frequency band, lasting infinitely, replacing the 42.7-hour pulse with absolute, sterile silence. The door was closed. I understood then that the geometry had confirmed our stability, finished its diagnosis, and sealed the weak point it had been exploiting to run the diagnostics. It had seen us, cataloged our fleeting interference, and simply shut off the local feed. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the laws of physics are merely parameters subject to external review, or that the silence that follows a terrifying revelation is far more crushing than the noise of the revelation itself. The quiet resolution is that we are safe, not because we fought back or understood, but because we were deemed too insignificant to require destruction. The geometry is gone from the frequency stream, but the terrible reflection of its perfect structure is permanently imprinted on the geometry of my mind. The fan is still humming. The observatory dome is utterly silent now, except for the low-level, predictable hiss of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the sound of our universe expanding blindly, oblivious to the external maintenance crew that just left. The desert air outside is cold, dropping the internal temperature of the dome rapidly. I watch the waterfall plots now, and they show only what they showed before the anomaly. Random, chaotic noise, the expected entropy of an unmanaged universe. The perfect, carved silence is gone, but I know what is truly there. The geometry is imprinted on the local space, the structure lingering like the memory of an impossible scent. When I look at the stars now, they shimmer with a slight, five-dimensional curvature that only I can perceive. I can still feel the faint, rhythmic pull on the passage of time, the echo of the geometry's influence, even in its absence. It's a comfortable, crushing stillness. The dread has softened into a permanent, internal ache, a quiet certainty that the vast, comforting chaos we perceive